In our previous video, you witnessed the hidden reality of empires, yet the secrets carried by ancient Greek concubines were even more disturbing. But before diving in, if you enjoy uncovering these forgotten and dark pieces of history, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment about where you're tuning in from. Your support helps us continue creating content like this. Now, let's return to the story. Ancient Greece gifted the world with democracy, profound philosophy, and breathtaking art. We remember Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle for their unmatched brilliance. We marvel at the Parthenon and honor the Olympic Games, which were born in their sacred groves. But behind the shining marble facades and lofty philosophical debates existed a system of sexual exploitation so entrenched and ruthless that it influenced every layer of Greek society for centuries. The Greeks had a specific word for these women, palakis. To our modern ears, it might sound refined, elegant, even like so many terms from the language that gave us philosophy and democracy, yet its meaning was far darker. A palakis was a woman stripped of every right, reduced to an object whose existence revolved solely around her master's desires and convenience. What made Greek concubinage particularly chilling was not only the exploitation itself, but how a culture famed for birthing rational thought and moral philosophy devised elaborate justifications for treating humans like cattle. The same men who discussed justice and virtue constructed legal frameworks that turned sexual slavery into something not just acceptable, but essential to what they considered civilized life. The process of selection reveals just how calculated this system truly was. Greek men did not choose their concubines at random. They hunted for them. With the precision of livestock breeders, young girls seized during military campaigns were scrutinized like animals at market. Their teeth were examined for health, their bodies checked for flaws, and their faces judged for beauty that would reflect their master's prestige. Foreign women were especially valued, for they had no local kin who might complicate ownership. A girl torn from Thrace or Asia Minor would arrive in Athens utterly alone, speaking a foreign tongue, practicing unfamiliar customs, with no one to protect her or even remember her name. This isolation was deliberate. It was a strategy designed to shatter any sense of identity that might fuel resistance. The legal standing of these women shows how deeply Greek society institutionalized sexual exploitation. A palakis had no rights under Greek law. She could not own property, could not give testimony, and could not shield her children from being sold away. Her master could strike her, rape her, lend her to his friends, or even kill her, facing little more than the penalty of replacing lost property. But the devastation ran deeper than the absence of legal rights. Greek masters knew that crushing a woman's spirit was more effective than merely controlling her body. One of the most insidious parts of the system was how it forced concubines to battle one another for survival. Many women might serve within a single household, but only those who most pleased their master could hope for better food, less cruelty, or security for their children. This twisted environment corroded the natural solidarity between women, weaponizing it into rivalry. Concubines betrayed one another, sabotaged rivals, and participated in each other's humiliation, because the alternative was often starvation or death. In this way, the Greeks engineered a system where victims were compelled to become complicit in their own oppression, and even in the destruction of others. The domestic arrangements reveal just how thoroughly concubines were woven into Greek family life. A wealthy man might keep his legitimate wife in the main household while housing a favored concubine nearby. Both women knew of each other's existence, yet the wife was expected to tolerate this as her husband's natural right. The concubine, however, lived under constant uncertainty, never knowing whether her status might rise or collapse. Sometimes the arrangement was even more twisted. The concubine might live under the same roof as the wife, serving as both sexual partner and servant. She was required to show deference to the lawful wife, while at the same time competing with her for the husband's attention and resources. The psychological torment of such a position drove many women into despair, madness, or suicide. Children born to concubines suffered an especially cruel fate that exposes the cold calculation at the heart of Greek exploitation. These children existed in a legal grey zone that masters manipulated for advantage. If a concubine birthed a promising son, he might be acknowledged and granted partial inheritance, but if the wife later bore legitimate male heirs, the concubine's children could be disowned, enslaved, or cast away. This uncertainty was intentional. By keeping the fate of children unstable, Masters ensured that concubines would submit to anything in hopes of protecting them. A woman could not risk angering her owner, for his displeasure might doom her child. This became a form of psychological control, far stronger than chains. The treatment of pregnant concubines reveals the unimaginable cruelty embedded in this system. Pregnancy, which should have been a period of protection and respect for new life, instead became another weapon of domination. If a pregnancy proved inconvenient, masters could order abortions by force, or even kill both mother and unborn child on mere suspicion of infidelity. The story of Periander illustrates how normalized this violence was in Greek society. When whispers reached him that his concubine, Melissa, who was pregnant, might have betrayed him, he did not bother with proof or inquiry. He simply struck her in the stomach with a kick, killing both her and the child instantly. What is most telling is what he did afterward. The women who had spread the rumors about Melissa were not spared. Periander had them burned alive, not because of their lies, but because they had become inconvenient witnesses to his brutality. The expendability of these women's lives was absolute. They could be erased at any moment, without explanation or consequence. Control over reproduction was another dimension of this exploitation. The bodies of concubines did not belong to themselves, not even their ability to bear children. They could not choose when to conceive, could not refuse sex during pregnancy, and had no authority to protect their children from being taken or sold. Sometimes, masters deliberately impregnated concubines to increase their household's stock. Any child born to an enslaved mother was automatically a slave, an asset to be sold, traded, or held as collateral. This practice turned human reproduction into a cold economic strategy. Women were forced to produce offspring that held monetary value, like livestock breeding. The psychological toll on these children was devastating. They grew up fully aware that their mothers had no power to protect them, that their fathers regarded them as property, and that their entire futures rested on the whims of men who did not see them as human. Many developed deep psychological scars, what today would be recognized as complex trauma. Yet perhaps the darkest part of concubinage was the way it normalized sexual violence as an everyday reality. Freeborn Greek women learned to endure their husbands' exploitation of enslaved women, since resisting would only bring shame or danger. Men grew accustomed to using sexuality as a means of power, free from condemnation. Children, observing these dynamics, absorbed the lesson that authority meant the right to dehumanize, that sexuality was inseparable from dominance, and that a person's value came not from their humanity, but from their legal standing. This normalization carried forward, producing generation after generation that accepted exploitation as natural. For them, it was simply the way society worked. The religious sphere reveals how deeply this culture of abuse infiltrated every level of Greek life. Temples themselves became institutions of sexual exploitation. Sacred prostitutes served both spiritual and commercial functions. Young girls consecrated to goddesses such as Aphrodite. The idea was that through sexual service, they honored the divine. But behind this veneer of sanctity lay organized trafficking endorsed by religion. The Temple of Aphrodite at Corinth is one of the most infamous examples. Ancient accounts describe over 1,000 sacred prostitutes housed within its walls. These women spent their lives inside the temple complex, servicing men who paid fees that enriched the priesthood. This arrangement provided steady income, while cloaking exploitation in religious legitimacy. Even funerary practices reflected this perverse integration of abuse. When wealthy Greek men died, their concubines faced choices that were no choices at all. Some were expected to kill themselves to accompany their masters into the afterlife. Others were sealed alive in tombs, sacrificed as if their deaths were part of a sacred duty. Their murders were treated as ritual obligation rather than crime. Archaeological discoveries support these grim accounts. Excavations of burial sites across Greece have revealed graves containing multiple bodies, sometimes with evidence of violent death or live burial. The positioning of skeletons suggests ritual sacrifice, where women were meant to provide companionship in death just as they had in life. Even in the grave, their exploitation continued. The economic machinery that sustained Greek concubinage was astonishing in its efficiency, resembling the operations of modern corporations. Slave markets in Athens, Corinth, and other prominent cities kept meticulous records of human transactions. Women were catalogued by age, origin, physical condition, and sexual experience. Their prices fluctuated according to demand, just like livestock or grain. Among the most prized were young virgin girls from conquered lands, especially those with fair skin and blonde hair. Greeks associated such features with northern tribes they considered barbarians, and these girls often fetched staggering prices, sometimes equivalent to small fortunes. Their value rested entirely on their perceived sexual appeal and the status they would bring to their owners. This pricing system exposes just how methodically Greek society commodified human sexuality. Professional slave traders operated vast networks that stretched across the Mediterranean, capturing women specifically for sexual purposes. These trafficking routes were so advanced that they even included breeding centers, where enslaved women were forced to bear children who would themselves become sexual slaves. This deliberate program of human breeding illustrates how far Greek civilization had strayed from any recognition of basic human dignity. The training of newly acquired concubines shows the psychological sophistication behind this system. Women were not merely thrown into service. They underwent calculated conditioning meant to dismantle resistance and reshape their identities to fit their master's will. This psychological breaking was often more effective than physical force. Newly captured women were separated from others who might provide comfort or encouragement to resist. They were stripped of their old names and given Greek ones, their native customs replaced with Greek practices. These changes cut them off from their homeland identities. Within months, many could barely recall their original names or families. Masters often used ceremonial rituals to cement their control. These rites symbolically killed the woman's former self, marking her rebirth as property. The effect was profound. Many concubines internalized their new roles so deeply that they began identifying with their captors. What today we might call Stockholm Syndrome became institutionalized on a societal scale. The medical practices tied to concubinage add another layer of cruelty. Greek physicians developed specialized knowledge in managing women's reproduction, but it was applied not for their welfare, rather to enhance their economic and sexual usefulness. Forced sterilizations were sometimes performed to allow sexual access without the inconvenience of pregnancy. These procedures were crude and frequently fatal, yet the deaths of concubines were dismissed as minor losses in the business of maintaining control. More common were primitive contraceptive methods that inflicted long-term pain and health issues, but allowed continued sexual exploitation without births. And when pregnancies did occur, concubines were treated like breeding stock. Physicians monitored them not for their safety, but to secure the profitable outcome of more slave children. Abortions were especially brutal. They often relied on poisonous herbs, physical violence, or crude surgical interventions that killed many more women than they spared. Masters forced these procedures whenever a pregnancy was unwanted, showing utter disregard for the immense danger posed to the mother's life. The casual willingness to sacrifice concubines in this way underscores how completely Greek society denied their humanity. Inside households with multiple concubines, the social dynamics created constant psychological warfare. This atmosphere served the masters well, ensuring that the women could never unite against them. Instead of forming bonds of solidarity, they were forced into relentless competition, each one striving for scraps of favor, safety, or food. Masters deliberately encouraged this rivalry. They established hierarchies among their concubines, rewarding obedience and betrayal with privileges. A woman who pleased her owner or undermined a rival might receive better living conditions, extra protection, or improved prospects for her children. This setup ensured that collaboration was impossible. The women became both victims and tools of the very system destroying them. The psychological toll was devastating. Concubines learned to see one another, not as allies, but as threats. Many internalized the misogyny of their oppressors so thoroughly that they became enforcers of their own subjugation. By turning women against each other, masters built a system of control more powerful than physical restraints. The passage of time brought another torment. Aging for concubines meant a steady decline toward disposability. Unlike freeborn Greek women, who could gain some measure of respect or security as they grew older, concubines lost value with each passing year. Their worth was tied solely to youth and sexual availability. When beauty faded, so did their use. Masters devised cruel methods to discard aging concubines. Some were sold to brothels, condemned to service low-paying clients until disease or exhaustion claimed them. Others were abandoned in the streets, left to starve once their bodies no longer brought pleasure. A few were kept in households for minor duties, such as cleaning or serving, while they watched younger concubines replace them. This fate was its own form of torture. They were forced to train their successors, living reminders of what they had lost and of the inevitability of their own decline. Even death did not end their exploitation. When a master died, concubines were treated as part of his estate, inherited like cattle or furniture. Adult sons might receive their father's concubines, which often meant that women were forced into sexual relationships with men they had once helped raise as children. Legal documents from the era confirm this practice. Wills often listed concubines as property, complete with descriptions of their physical features or sexual skills. Such records show how utterly normalized it was to treat human beings as transferable assets, even after years of intimate service. When concubines attempted to resist, the punishments they endured were designed to terrify others into submission. Small acts of rebellion, such as refusing service, attempting escape, or aiding fellow women, were crushed with overwhelming brutality. Public executions became spectacles, where entire communities gathered to watch the destruction of women who dared to defy their masters. These executions were not swift. They often involved prolonged sexual torture, meant to prove that even in death, a concubine's body still belonged to her owner. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would not only fail, but would amplify suffering beyond imagination. Occasionally, individual concubines managed to exploit contradictions within the system to secure better conditions or help others. Some became indispensable to their masters, wielding influence to protect certain women or arrange escapes. But these victories were precarious and came at terrible cost. A woman who gained any power did so by becoming complicit in maintaining the system. Protecting one concubine often meant sacrificing another. In this way, even resistance was corrupted, transformed into another mechanism that reinforced oppression. The trade networks that fueled Greek concubinage stretched across the entire Mediterranean. Greek merchants built specialized posts for capturing and transporting women. Human trafficking evolved into an industry, complete with methods to weaken women psychologically before they even reached Greek soil. Long voyages by sea became sites of calculated torment. Isolated from their families and cultures, women were subjected to constant abuse meant to shatter their identities. By the time they arrived at markets in Athens or Corinth, many had already been broken, conditioned to accept the role of concubine. The effects of this system rippled far beyond Greece itself. Other civilizations, including Rome and Egypt, adopted similar practices after encountering Greek culture. The philosophical justifications created by Greek intellectuals spread across borders, forming a template for exploitation. Thinkers who wrote about justice and ethics also crafted arguments, explaining why certain groups of humans could be treated as property. These ideas, once recorded, endured for centuries, shaping attitudes about human dignity and power long after Greece had fallen. Archaeological discoveries continue to shed light on the true scope of this exploitation, often confirming the most harrowing details preserved in ancient accounts. Excavations of burial sites, domestic quarters, and slave markets have revealed physical evidence of the concubine system's brutality. DNA analysis of skeletal remains has uncovered demographic patterns consistent with widespread human trafficking. These studies show how Greek practices disrupted family structures and reshaped population dynamics across generations. The genetic echoes of this exploitation can still be traced in Mediterranean populations today. Modern psychological research helps us understand how deeply these abuses scarred not only the women but also the society around them. The children of concubines carried forward inherited trauma. They grew up in households where love was conditional, power was abusive, and human worth was reduced to ownership. These patterns fostered cycles of violence that endured long after the immediate victims had passed. What makes this history even more disturbing is how it forces us to question the relationship between cultural achievement and systematic cruelty. The very society that gave birth to democracy, philosophy, and the arts also perfected techniques of sexual enslavement. These practices were not mistakes or isolated deviations. They were embedded policies, woven into the very structure of Greek civilization. Their influence extended far beyond antiquity. Legal frameworks, social hierarchies, and cultural attitudes shaped by Greek concubinage rippled outward, leaving marks that can still be recognized today. The intellectual justifications crafted by philosophers became tools that other societies would later adapt to rationalize slavery, patriarchy, and systems of dehumanization. And yet, The women who endured this deserve to be remembered, not merely as faceless victims, but as individuals. Their suffering built the foundations of a culture that we often celebrate while forgetting its darker truths. Their stories reveal that progress and cruelty can exist side by side, that intellectual brilliance does not guarantee moral advancement, and that any society can fall into systematic dehumanization if its vulnerable are left unprotected. The legacy of Greek concubinage stretches far beyond the boundaries of ancient history. It shaped concepts of power, sexuality, and human value that still echo in modern society. By studying these practices, we can see how exploitation becomes normalized, how systems of cruelty disguise themselves as tradition, and how intellectual brilliance can coexist with moral collapse. Understanding this reality allows us to recognize similar patterns in the present day. Human trafficking, reproductive control, and the commodification of bodies are not relics of the past. They are dangers that persist whenever societies fail to protect the vulnerable. The lessons from ancient Greece remind us that no cultural achievement, however dazzling, can excuse the abandonment of human dignity. The Greek concubine system represents one of civilization's greatest betrayals, a complete denial of the principle that every human life has inherent worth. Its consequences were catastrophic, leaving scars across generations and shaping civilizations that followed. Yet, remembering these women gives their stories back the humanity that was stolen from them. They were more than property, more than statistics in forgotten records. They were human beings, with names, dreams, and voices, silenced by a system that refused to acknowledge their existence. Their suffering must not vanish into obscurity. By speaking their truth, we restore their dignity. By confronting this dark history, we arm ourselves against its repetition. The most vital lesson may be that civilization's highest achievements can hide its deepest crimes, and that vigilance against dehumanization remains as urgent today as it was in ancient Greece. Human dignity is not negotiable, never bound by law, culture, or history. To forget that truth is to risk repeating the same tragedies, and the voices of those women, though long silenced, still echo through time, demanding that we remember